Okay, good morning. It's always morning time in video land. So this is the fourth video, but this is really part three of our look at Othello. And what we really want to look at is no longer simply the plot, what it consists of, but precisely what Iago does to pour the pestilence in Othello's ear, and to make a series of insinuations, suggestions that are rather subtle to Othello in order to convince him that his wife is unfaithful. One of the most fascinating things about Iago's plot, particularly as it pertains to his manipulation of Othello, is that he does the most minimal amount of lying that is possible. Whenever you lie, you want to have to tell, this is a little secret, so folks handle with care. Whenever you lie, you want to have to tell the fewest lies possible. And even better than that is to surround a lie with many, many, many truths, so that your credibility is built up. Iago only tells about two or three really consequential lies to Othello, particularly in, eventually he does say, effectively, your wife is cheating on you. But prior to that, he finds a way of just placing seeds of doubt in Othello's ear, in Othello's mind, in Othello's heart. And all he does is he plants those seeds in Othello's soul, and it's the particular terroir, it's the particular characteristics of Othello's soul that make those seeds grow all on their own. So we want to look at the mechanics of particularly the language that he uses. And we're going to talk about this in relationship to Plato's cave, because he creates a cave of appearances that Othello, as their psychic prisoner in this kind of matrix made by Iago, he falls subject to. So the two primary things we're going to do today is, number one, we've talked about the influence of the political thinker and statesman Niccolo Machiavelli in this rebirth. He is part of the really fundamental role in the Renaissance, in politics in particular, but politics, the science of politics, is really in many ways the science of human nature, is the science of human psychology, is the science of human motivation. So Machiavelli made some very keen and naturalistic observations of human nature and political and social arrangements, relationships between people and what people want. Based on this more naturalistic look at society, instead of looking at it through the lens of what you'd like it to be, if you want to make it better, you have to first acknowledge the way human beings really are. And in a sense, it's very much a humanistic embrace of humanity. To love human beings, to be interested in human beings, is to love and be interested in a fundamentally flawed or a fundamentally deficient being. God is a manifestation of perfection, and God exists precisely because of the imperfections of human beings. Or rather, the need for God exists because of the imperfections of human beings. So we're going to look at a little overview of kind of Machiavellian themes. Machiavelli as an author was deeply influential on the politics and literature of Renaissance England, and perhaps more than any other nation. They really absorbed his teachings in a rather concrete way, and we see echoes, particularly because this takes place in Renaissance Italy. We see, I think, very self-conscious echoes of a kind of Machiavellian spirit which pervades this entire text. It's not unique to Shakespeare by any means, but I think this text is particularly exemplary of those themes. After we do that, then we're going to look at the relationship between Plato's cave and the way Iago works his magic his conjuration, his seduction of Othello through words and through sowing doubt in his mind, without really lying to him. He just presents things that then Othello takes up in his own mind. And we'll read a couple passages that really exemplify that. In particular, we talked in previous lecture, the way in which the language and plot of Othello is really defined by this distinction between appearance and reality. And it is a very strategic and self-conscious decision on the part. There's many things you don't know about a playwright because they present you a play rather than an autobiography. But one thing that becomes clear is the very strategic use of language that is built around a distinction between appearance and reality that lets us know this is really one of the fundamental themes of the play. And why is it a fundamental theme of the play? Because it's a fundamental theme of human life. At some point toward the beginning of the semester, we talked about simply reading a person is very much like reading a book. When you read a book, you're given words, but what your goal is to glean the thought behind the words. And we talked at great length about the fact that words don't exactly mean just what they say, literally. You see them in the context of a stated bit of speech, and that the thought behind them is something slightly above and beyond the words on the page. They point to that meaning, but they don't spell it out without making an inference. Human conduct is the same way. Because we have conscious awareness, we can be duplicitous, just like a text. We can present one image here in our words and also our deeds, and even to some extent our body language. But what's going on here and what's going on here is not necessarily the same. And this is simply a phenomena that human beings are capable of performing in a way animals, for the most part, are not. This specific type of deception. And so it's not anything intrinsically bad, but it obviously can be exploited for nefarious purposes, and that's exactly what Iago does. In particular, in this difference between the presentation of the person and what they really are, we're going to talk about this expression. He's constantly called honest Iago. Honest Iago. Okay, so let's get going. The world of Renaissance Venice, the world that is the setting of Othello, is a Machiavellian world. And a Machiavellian world, by definition, is a world of self-interest. Machiavelli, an incredible psychologist of human nature, of human beings. This was a man that had this rare combination of book learning and book smarts, but also street smarts. He knew people high, he knew people low, and he also had adept, just broad education. And his view of the world, that regardless of what thinkers, kings, politicians, statesmen, regardless of what they wanted of the world, he forthrightly acknowledged something that we take to be a central principle of economic thought, which is that all human actions are defined by self-interest. That number one, that every action we take, we seek to benefit ourselves, and that we use part of the concept of self-interest. It's actually a fairly nuanced concept, but for our purposes, the key thing is that typically our passions define the objects of our desire, and we use our reason to find the best way, the most efficient way, the least costly way. That's economics 101, to get what we want, It just turns out that Iago wants something that, people aren't supposed to have, that's against morality, against the Ten Commandments, against the law. But there's a dark lurking theme here of, if this is who this man is and this is what he wants, this is just what he's going to do. That's part of nature produces a diversity of human types. And the person who is good at doing things that are bad or illegal, where do they fit in society? they fit just where they do. They perform their actions, and maybe they get caught, and maybe they don't. That's the brutal truth of this world. So in many sense, when we're talking about a Machiavellian world, to some extent, we're simply talking about the way Machiavelli is seeing this world as this is what people really do. This is the way they're really like. Let's not pretend. So in his seminal work, The Prince, he wants to understand political things first by taking human beings as they really are, that what motivates them is self-interest, that they may cloak themselves in higher and noble causes, but that's not really what's motivating them. That's a kind of propaganda. His next great thesis is that what is the motivating principle or the information on which people base their decisions in the real world, it's not the truth. It's not the truth. He says, rather, what is the driving thing that human beings respond to, the kind of external stimuli, is what he calls the effectual truth of the thing. Now, this is the first probably use in philosophy of a dubious meaning of truth, because it turns out the effectual truth of the thing is not necessarily the truth at all. It's just effectual. It's what appears to be the case, and it is the thing that effectually motivates people to do what they do. So, for example, I read in the paper about coronavirus. That statement, let's just say, is totally false, but I believe it to be true, and then I act on it, and I go out and I do something, or I buy something, or I socially distance, or whatever it is. I do it on the basis of thinking that it's true. And he says, forget about the philosophers. They want to be concerned with the truth. The reality is people live their life based on what they think is true rather than what is actually true. And in fact, the effectual truth, in a sense, can be made the truth, because once people start acting on it, they start performing actions that are very real, right? And they do it on that basis, and it becomes, in a sense, a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you can see here the logic of deception, the logic of propaganda, such that if a social or political actor wants to get a certain outcome, they can purposely promote something false if they believe that someone will act on it, and that will help achieve their end. And you see, that's exactly what Iago does. So for Machiavelli, we live in a world of appearances and therefore hypocrisy. We have to keep up appearances. We're all self-interested. It's a world of barefaced self-interest, but it's impolite in almost any society to act in a totally self-interested manner. You have to conceal that behind righteousness, behind proper principles, behind virtue, and for Machiavelli's case, cardinal Greek and Roman and Christian virtues, justice, wisdom, charity, hope, and so on and so forth. So therefore you're hypocritical. What you present is not what you really are. And underneath it all, he's kind of ripping off the veil and saying we're all self-interested. So therefore for Machiavelli or Machiavellian politics or society, it doesn't have to be strictly about politics. It's marked by cunning, duplicity, and bad faith. That in a nutshell describes Iago perfectly. So bad faith simply means when you act in good faith, you act on the stated intention that you've broadcast to everyone. To act in bad faith is to claim a motive or a course of action or a principle that is not actually your real motive or the thing that compels you to do what you do. So his whole look at politics is a very realistic, hard-boiled, bare-knuckled political realism. His overall outlook stresses the this-worldly over the other-worldly. And the Renaissance had a very interesting relationship to Christianity in general, because it had, on one hand, certain criticisms to be made of the effects of religion in general, the effects of Christianity in particular, and that's certainly true of Machiavelli. At the same time, Machiavelli is generally considered to be a believer, and while he was concerned about certain negative effects of Christianity on society, he generally saw religion as absolutely instrumental. And throughout most Renaissance thought, instead of seeing, despite its naturalistic heritage and influence coming from pagan Greece and Rome, you actually typically see a synthesis of Greco-Roman thinking and Christian thought. This is important. For Machiavelli, saints and martyrs are suckers, or die for fictive causes. They die for things that aren't worth it, because the things martyrs die for are transcendent principles that have no clear instantiation in the real world. Anyone who's sensible tries to get what they want without sacrificing their life. And everybody knows that what's pleasurable are the goods of this world. So saints have no standing, because for them, this world is not completely meaningless, but it is at least meaningless compared to the rewards of the other life and faith and so on and so forth. So Machiavelli acknowledges that not only is it natural that human beings have desires and motivations of this world, like sex and wealth and power and so on and so forth, that these are actually acceptable motives within certain parameters, which is something that is, distinctly, not a Christian point of view. And he says, why are they suckers? Why are they suckers? He has a very specific and a very elegant, simple reason. In a bad world, good men, he says this in The Prince, in a bad world, good men come to their ruin. Now, in a bad world, good men come to their ruin. Now, let's just be clear. This is Othello. Othello is a good man. One of the problems with Othello is he doesn't have any obvious negative traits. He is not self-consciously cruel or evil, or he doesn't willfully try to do the wrong thing the way Iago does. He doesn't know bad when he sees it. He sees the enemy on the battlefield. The difference between the battlefield of society versus the battlefield of the military is, on the military battlefield, it's a little more clear to see who the enemy is. In society, it's much more challenging, and the different skills are required. But it's not Iago who is honest. It is Othello, because Othello presents externally what he feels internally, and he thinks that's the right thing to do. And for a good person, it's obviously understandable why they think that. But if you're a good person in a bad world, what happens? What happens? If everybody's doing bad, and you're the only one that follows the rules, you're going to be the first person to be taken advantage of, because precisely by your rule following, you're going to be exploited. You're not going to know to get what you can for yourself by dastardly means, because you're, in a sense, tying your hand behind your back by following the rules, whereas no one else is doing that. So they're going to benefit it at your expense, right? So this is Machiavelli. If you want to understand what it means to be Machiavellian, this is the lesson that Niccolo Machiavelli takes, that we see on display here. In a bad world, the prince must learn how not to be good. And you got to love that expression, how not to be good. The prince has to learn how to be bad, right? Not necessarily evil, which is to say a matter of degree. We have to learn how to be bad. So this is something that let's be clear, this is the Venetian context here. Everybody knows human beings transgress, and they're not in an awful world. It's not a dystopian world. We're not at that extreme. We're in a self-interested world where people look out for number one, right? And the person who doesn't is considered a fool. Othello and Desdemona have an element of that naivete that if you're a Machiavellian you would call foolish, right? And you can see exactly why they then become subject to be exploited. And they're almost like a kind of sacrificial lamb. I mean, a lamb is this kind of innocent being sacrificed to the horrible forces of the world. Human motivation is a big force in the human world. And they're offered up as a kind of innocent sacrifice. So in England, this is great. Machiavelli was often called Old Nick, which was is actually a reference to the devil. So the connection between Machiavelli and evil is quite explicit in the Italian context, and also in the British. There is an interesting catch, though. There is certainly a limit to what can be pursued through self-interest because of the collective pressures of other people pursuing their own self-interest. If you pursue your self-interest in a way that fundamentally harms other people are going to find out, and you're going to be called out. You're going to be prevented from pursuing your self-interest. So in society, we're still forced to present ourselves as good, even when we do bad. And in fact, if you want to perpetrate fraud or harm on other people, deception is part and parcel of that process. And this is summed up in La Rochefoucauld's comment: hypocrisy is the homage vice pays to virtue. Vice, committing bad acts, being bad, being evil, pays homage, pays respect to virtue or proper conduct by hypocrisy. What is hypocrisy? Duplicity. The person who is bad or engages in vice must, in society, present themselves as righteous if they are going to get away with the things they want to get away with. And that's exactly what Iago does. There is no way for him to succeed at this plot if he doesn't use a tremendous amount of deception. So I want to briefly talk about, this is connected with Machiavelli, and it will lead into a general discussion of Iago's motivations. So virtually every analysis of human motivation sees at the heart of the human soul a conflict between reason and the passions, right? The passions are the blind impulses that direct you towards certain objects. And the problem with the passions is that they're blind and don't appreciate the real worth of the things they're directed toward, nor do they consider or are capable of considering the potential consequences of their actions, the negative consequences. Historically, reason is understood that thing as what calculates what the right thing is to do, or how to go about to get that thing you want, right? So reason can be what's called end determining. A reason could be called instrumental. End determining reason simply means this: my reason dictates to me what is the right thing to do, the end of my actions, the goal of my actions. Therefore, reason determines the end or goal of my actions. Instrumental reason is reason being used as a tool to fulfill a goal or end dictated by my passions. And in a world of self-interest that Machiavelli recognizes, he sees humanity as primarily driven by their passions. And that when they reason, when they use their intelligence, they don't use it wisely to determine the right thing. Rather, they use their reason to figure out how best to get what they really want, dictated by their heart, or by their gut, or whatever it happens to be. So you see in Iago this aquiline intelligence, this kind of a clairvoyant sensibility about the people around him and how he can manipulate them. And yet his reason is all dedicated to a goal that's driven by a fundamentally mysterious and dark motivation or passion that really, I don't think, it's neither clear to the viewer or the other characters or even to Iago himself, despite his intelligence. Right? So David Hume, the 18th century Scottish thinker, who was very influenced by this analysis of Machiavelli in his look at human motivation. David Hume, in a famous work, he says, reason is and ought to be a slave to the passions. Now, making reason a slave to the passions is exactly the definition of instrumental reason. One of the very fascinating ways to look at this relationship between Iago and Othello is that they're really one soul, and that Iago is the reason dictating to Othello, and Othello is the passionate one being controlled by the rational one. It's really quite fascinating. So the challenge here is that the passions are blind and inchoate. They don't consider the consequences of their actions or their object. So let's just consider the kinds of things that people want, right? You might say that all of these things come under the rubric of self-interest. There's no discussion of higher principles. There's no discussion of faith. There's no discussion of duty here. It's all things that benefit oneself. So, is it wealth? Is it security? Is it reputation? Is it knowledge? Is it pleasure? Is it love or sex? Is it power? Right? And you see, all these characters want something slightly different for various reasons. So, Othello, he seems to be primarily motivated by love. But then you notice, in the way he handles the situation, if he loves Desdemona for her own sake, why would he kill her? Now, he has a certain justification to take retribution on his wife for cheating on him. But he needn't not go through with that. He's in a society that has choices. He doesn't have to do that. And I would argue that he is not singularly concerned with Desdemona for her own sake. Rather, he's concerned with Desdemona for what she represents. Someone who gives him respect, someone who gives him additional standing within Venetian society, makes him feel more integrated, and also he gets the honor and recognition of being loved by a person of high esteem who's beautiful and who's this daughter of a senator and so on and so forth. And yet, once that's violated with the supposed transgression that she commits, then he loses all that repute and esteem. So he doesn't seem to be simply motivated by love. He seems to be motivated by honor and reputation, precisely because it's established throughout the play he is insecure about being in this world, despite the fact that he meets many of its criteria in it. Desdemona seems actually generally driven by love in a very innocent way. Iago, driven by revenge. Rodrigo, partly driven by money because he's wealthy, and partly driven by a kind of obsessive possessiveness. And you wonder if that's not just an extension of his own wealth and his desire for wealth, that he desires to possess things. And obviously Othello has that own, he's not driven by money, but he desires to possess this woman, and he doesn't want anyone else to have her. And that's not exactly the same as love, because you would think real love would be negotiating the situation with his wife's transgression under the assumption that he believes that that's true. If we look at Cassio, he takes his love affairs very trivially, and what he really cares about as a soldier is reputation. He makes that very clear in Act 2. He says, you take my reputation, you take the essence of who I am. Okay. Now, we looked at this speech in the previous video, so we're not going to recount it all, but we're just going to hit some key points to it in relationship to what we just talked about, which is, here's the speech in Act 1 where Iago talks about, I follow Othello to serve my turn upon him. We cannot all be masters, nor all masters cannot be truly followed. And then he talks about two types of servants. He is a servant to Othello. He talks about the duteous servant, who's the knave and the fool, because all they do is serve their master. And then he talks about the real servant, who's really more clever than their master, who trimmed in forms and visages of duty, keep yet their breasts, attending on themselves, and throwing but shows, appearances of service and duty to their lords, do well thrive by them, when they have lined their coats, do themselves homage. These fellows have some soul, right? So this speech right here is the kind of epitome of the Machiavellian attitude that there is only this world, the duty, essentially something to this effect. Since if you take human beings as they are naturally self-interested. Part of the natural disposition of the human being not just is, but should be, to serve their own self-interests. And if you are serving the interest of another, you are actually wasting your life away. He says, many a duteous and knee-crooking knaves, that, doting on his obsequious bondage, that's slavery and servitude, wears out his time much like his master's ass, wears out his time. He wastes his life for naught but provender, and when he's old, cashiered. So for nothing but food and shelter, provender, room and board, we might say. So this is a kind of paean, or a kind of eulogy to the Machiavellian spirit of self-interest. And then the second aspect of that is the hypocrisy that Machiavelli describes as really the currency of the social and political world. He said, we've talked about this, but just to reiterate, who trimmed in forms and visages of duty. So this person, and there's this lovely image, trimmed in forms and visages of duty. So to trim, to decorate a tree, form is a shape, visage is a face, it's a surface, right? So he's going to put on the garb of duty. But then when you peel back the outfit, he says they have lined their coats. They've taken what they wanted from their appearance, from their false appearance of service. And we're all sitting there saying of this speech by this diabolical character called Iago, we're saying, man, that sounds about right. Like, who's going to waste their life for another person who, if everybody's self-interested, the master's not really concerned for you. They're making shows of concern, just like we're making shows down here. So let's all just fake it and get what we want, right? I mean, what's so disturbing here is the rationality and to some degree, the accuracy of the world that Iago paints. So let's turn now to a look at Iago's motives, such as they are explained to Rodrigo in their ongoing discussion of their conspiracy. Rodrigo wants Desdemona, Iago wants to get Othello, and they're both going to work together. They both have different things to offer to unfold this plot. Little does Rodrigo know that he's really being used by Iago, yet the audience here, the reader here, it's very clear that Iago is manipulating Rodrigo. And he describes, he says at one point in these passages, I will make my fool my purse. And he talks about his purse is where he holds the money, and Rodrigo, he keeps saying, Rodrigo, give me your money. Rodrigo, give me your money. And Rodrigo is more than happy to give him all his money, precisely because he thinks it's going to get him Desdemona, and he's so obsessed. Love is that desire that makes people unruly and foolish, and makes them to do things that short-circuit their rational defense mechanism. And the purse has purse strings that can be pulled and manipulated, and Rodrigo is the fool who is the purse, and it's Iago who holds the purse strings. The person who holds the purse strings is the person who doles out the money, right? So ironically, it's Rodrigo giving him money, but it's Iago who's really controlling the flow of the money because he understands the psychology of Rodrigo and he's exploiting it, and he's getting him to just, his money's just coming out. And in a sense, he's not doing it under his own volition. He's doing it precisely because Iago knows how to manipulate him. So we also see Rodrigo's motives on display here. And Rodrigo says, "Wilt thou be fast to my hopes if I depend on the issue?" Will you be fast? Will you be steadfast? Will you help to realize my hopes of getting Desdemona? His life, he said his life depends on the issue. He says if he can't get Desdemona, he's going to kill himself, right? And Iago, of course, finds this totally ridiculous because Iago, if you're a Machiavellian, you're the antithesis of a romantic. You're not sentimental. You are hard-boiled and rational, and people shouldn't put their life at risk for such foolish things like love. And Iago says this, "Thou art sure of me. Go make money. I have told thee often, and I retell thee again and again, I hate the Moor." Now, he says he hates the Moor, but we don't really know why. And yes, at this stage of Act 1, he has already acknowledged that Cassio took a position that he claims he wanted. He says Cassio got it unjustly, and he says he is really the person who merited that job, and he hates Cassio for taking it. You know, the motive for Iago, we're looking at this precisely because of the elusive nature of it, but one thing that's always speculated is that he wanted the position both as a recognition of his own worth in society, and therefore Iago wants some type of recognition. And that's part of his the baseline of his motivation. But particularly that he may have also wanted to be close to Othello. And of course, there's lots of interesting speculation these days with things like queer theory that say like, oh, he really had some kind of homosexual erotic attraction to them. I don't find any clear evidence of that. And of course, you know, why is it that, for example, heterosexual men can't have a certain bond toward one another? I do think it's, however, very legitimate to suggest the possibility that he does have some affinity for Othello. He does want to be seen in a positive light by Othello. He does yearn for his acceptance. And he feels he's been slighted, not just because he has the merit of the position, but also because he feels slighted by a particular person, Othello, who he wants to think. He wants to have Othello to think. He wants Othello to think highly of him. Right? I hate the Moor. My cause is harded. Thine hath no less reason. Let us be conjunctive in our revenge against him. Conjunctive. Let's work together. If thou canst cuckold him, and thou dost thyself a pleasure, me a sport. Right? So this starts to get to cuckold Othello is to sleep with his wife, and that would make him a cuckold. So let's be conjunctive. You're going to make him a cuckold and gain pleasure, and for me, I'm going to have my sport. This raises another motivation. This is simply something Iago is good at. It's sport for him. Bringing about this downfall is just the employment of his peculiar faculties and a showing of his own excellence. There are many events in the womb of time which will be delivered. Traverse, go provide thy money. We will have more of this tomorrow. Adieu. So, there are many events in the womb of time which will be delivered. Womb, being delivered. So, there's something that's going to be given birth to. What is the thing that's going to be given birth to? What is the womb? The womb is Iago's soul, or Iago's head and his heart. And the thing that's going to be given birth to is his thoughts. That's to say his plot. And, of course, when he says this to Rodrigo, Rodrigo is thinking that what's going to be revealed is the plot against Othello that's going to advantage him. And, of course, what Rodrigo doesn't know is how he is also part of this plot, or rather going to be a victim of it when it is delivered. And Rodrigo says later on, I'm changed, right? Because at the outset of this conversation, Rodrigo was in great despair that he wasn't going to get Desdemona, precisely because he became aware that they had eloped. And Iago has to bolster his ego by giving him more hope, or hope at all, and therefore justifying his hope that he's ever going to get Desdemona. Because, like, of course, he's not. Desdemona has no interest in him. And Iago is just holding that out as a carrot to manipulate Rodrigo. He says, I'm changed, I'll sell all my land. See, this is what love does to people. It makes them crazy. And of course, this is a bit of foreshadowing here of the insanity that Othello is going to suffer, because he desires to possess Desdemona so tightly that when he even considers the possibility of her infidelity, he goes mad. And that's depicted quite clearly later on. He's depicted as having these kind of seizures or epileptic fits, but they're really not to be understood as a medical condition. They're really understood to be a kind of almost like a fugue of emotion, and a fugue of emotion that is the result of the way in which Iago has wrought his mind and perplexed it so deeply in his own understanding that he enters these kind of epileptic fits. And if you watch the film, you will see them depicted very clearly. He says, go to Fellware, farewell, put money enough in your purse. Thus do I ever make my fool my purse. For I am own gain knowledge should profane, if I were to time expend with such a snipe. But for my sport and profit. So why does he do this? For his sport and profit. So for fun and for profit. Well, what does he gain? Because the profit clearly is not monetary. He says it again. I hate the more, and it is thought abroad. And remember now, Rodrigo has left. We are now in a soliloquy, a character speaking with no one else present, something that is a central feature of Shakespeare's plays. And who is he speaking to with no one on stage? Well, in a sense, he's speaking to himself. A lot, you could say what's really going on is an internal dialogue, and sometimes soliloquies. There's a famous version of Hamlet done by Laurence Olivier, in which Hamlet's soliloquies, he's not actually, it's a film, so he's not actually speaking, but they're voiced over, so he's really thinking it in his head. So when the soliloquy is given, it's thoughts in someone's head that they're speaking to themselves, but they're also speaking to the audience. And if you watch the film, you will see the way in which Iago makes an aside to the audience. He turns his head toward the camera, looks at us, and he tells us what's really on his mind. And what's so fascinating about these moments is that it appears, at least, that we've transformed from the hypocritical Iago, from honest, good friend Iago, to the real Iago. The question is, even when he turns to us in these honest moments, do we really know what's going on in his mind? Do we really get the truth of him? I would argue that it is not entirely clear that that's the case, and that's part of the game being played by Shakespeare. The important thing as well is that we are made co-conspirators with Iago. We are the ones who know the plot. We have what's called dramatic irony, which is to say we're aware of consequential or material facts unfolding in the story that the other characters are not aware of, and they act in a certain way precisely because they are not aware of the facts we're aware of, and because they're acting on the effectual truth of the thing rather than the whole truth of the thing. So he's talking to us, Iago is. It's, I hate the more, and it is thought abroad, like in far-off lands, that twixt my sheets he's done my office. Right? So look at the formulation here. It is thought abroad. Well, I don't know. Is that in some other city-state in Italy? Somewhere outside Venice, right? And that's distant information or intelligence. That twixt between my sheets, in my bed, he's done my office. What are you saying? He slept with my wife. Now listen to this. Does Iago know that Othello has slept with his wife? No. He has no first-hand evidence. He's heard a rumor. Right? So on what basis is this? I mean, he's got a wife that he lives with, and he's got Venetians who might know. Cassio might know such a thing, right? And the thing is, given what we know about Othello, it's not clear that this is a true statement, and it's not even clear whether Iago really believes it, right? Iago's a smart guy. He can differentiate a rumor from fact. On the other hand, his wife and he in their relationship is presented as a very loosey-goosey relationship because they understand the kind of Machiavellian self-interested nature of the both of them, and they kind of do what they want. And I wouldn't say they have an open marriage, but it's kind of understood that if one cheats on the other, that's not something to be terribly surprised by. But, I mean, he's telling us this is his motive, and it's not at all clear that this is a real motive. Is this motive for him to do what he's doing? Question mark. And let's also be clear, this is also the third motive he's presented us. First it was Cassio and being slighted, then it was for sport, and now it's for profit, which is to say revenge. I know not if it be true, but I, for mere suspicion in that kind, will do as if for surety. He acknowledges it's not true. He actually acknowledges it might not be true at all. But he says, I'm going to purposely act for surety, as if it's true for sure, when he precisely knows that it's not. What kind of person is this, I ask? He holds me well. See, that's the honest, good friend Iago. That's going to be the thing that he's going to exploit. He holds me well. The better shall my purpose work on him. Well, what's he saying here? If Othello trusts him, he's going to better be able to pull off deceptions, because Othello is going to have no reason to think he's being deceived by someone he trusts. The better shall my purpose work on him. Cassio's a proper man. Let me see now. 'Tis get his place, and to plume up my will in double knavery. Knavery here is kind of like committing a crime is going to be a double crime against Cassio and Othello. How? Let's see. After some time to abuse Othello's ear. That's what we're going to look at later. That he's too familiar, Cassio, is too familiar with his wife. He hath a person and a smooth dispose to be suspected, framed to make women false. So now it's actually triple knavery, because he's going to harm Desdemona's virtue as well. The more is of a free and open nature. This is what makes Othello a good man, that he is of a free and open nature. But in Venetian society, around people like Iago, it makes him vulnerable because he is the good man in a sneaky world, right? He thinks most men honest, that but seem to be so. So here's the language of appearance and reality. Just like we saw it, perhaps he's slept with my wife. I only have mere suspicion, which is to say an appearance. It's a rumor, but I'm going to take it as if I know for surety, as if I know it to be the case. Here he says, he takes men as honest who merely seem to be honest. Well, that's Iago, right? That's exactly what Iago is going to exploit. He's literally telling us exactly he's going to do and how it's going to unfold. And will as tenderly be led by the nose as asses are. So Othello is treated in this he's very naive. He is open, he is honest. And this is why the Machiavellian angle matters, because this innocence, this naivete is not respected. It's treated, if you are like this in this kind of world, you are a sucker. And in fact, you know what? You deserve to get your comeuppance for being so foolish. And Machiavelli presents the same type of mentality. He says, I have it. It is engendered. Remember we talked about the womb and the birth. It is engendered. To gender, genesis, it has its root word in birth. To be engendered is it's born, or like it's impregnated, and it's coming to life. Hell and night. This is the kind of language of dark and light here. We have hell and night. He's giving birth to something diabolical. He says, hell and night must bring this monstrous birth to the world's light. What is the monstrous birth? Well, that's an interesting question. On one hand, it's quite clearly the plot that is the progeny of Iago's mind, that is going to be brought to light into the world from his mind into physical actions as he sets out these deceptions on the other characters, right? But the monstrous birth is not just Iago's plot, it's also what it does to Othello. His plot brings out something, you might even say diabolical and sinister in Othello, that we didn't quite realize was there. Because the intense passion and fervor, this kind of fugue of emotion that is unleashed with Othello, is also consistent with something that is understood just traditionally as diabolical passions. The green-eyed monster of jealousy, for example. And the very kinds of passions that ideally, whether you're talking about in Christian morality or in Greek and Roman morality, one uses reason or faith to control and regulate. And that Othello really clearly fails. And so Othello is going to be led by the nose, as asses are, right? So you can see what he thinks of Othello. Othello is an intelligent man, but he's not exactly wise in the ways of the world. And there are those nose rings that are on a bull and certain animals, and what they allow you to do is to pull the animal, and they offer no resistance, I suppose because it's the way it's in their nose, but it allows you to tame them and to get them to do your bidding, despite the fact that they are powerful and potentially dangerous animals to you. You've neutralized them through this technique. And it's that subtlety and that deception that allows him to manipulate Othello in this way. So, let's conclude with this thought. We've learned a lot about Iago's motive, and on the other hand, we've learned nothing. Because I'd like to say that he's provided so many explanations as to why he is doing this, as to provide no explanation at all. When you get to court, and you've done something, it's probably something clear as to why it is. With Iago, we really haven't gotten to the core of what his motivation is. Now I want to conclude with a look at Iago's cave. Iago's cave, and we'll touch back on Plato's cave in just a moment. I simply want to look at the word honest, because there is an epithet that constantly runs throughout of this text of good friend Iago and honest Iago, and those two are really connected. Everybody thinks that he is a good friend because what have we said he does? He creates the problem, and then for each character, and then he actually is the person offering the solution. And in doing that, he plays the role of the friend who comes to the friend who is in need and is a friend indeed. When we think of the word honest, we think of the word truthful. So let's be clear. Honest Iago, he is the antithesis of honest, right? So there's something profoundly ironic and funny when every character, almost every Desdemona, Othello, Cassio, all say this of Iago. And of course, it's ironic and funny because it's not true. And it's also disturbing because we, as the viewers and readers, have the dramatic irony to see just how untrue it actually is. So we think of honesty, we think of truthfulness. But there are many shades of meaning of the word honest, particularly going back to the 17th century, the time the play was written, that inform what's really being said when they say honest Iago. Because remember what Iago had just said. Othello treats people as honest even when they only seem to be honest, even when they're not actually honest. So this duplicity between seeming and being, or appearance and reality. And of course, this word sits at the heart of that distinction. So the modern sense, an honest person is someone who is dealing fairly, who is truthful, who is free from deceit. I mean, you can see how this definition fits the whole atmosphere of what's being stated here. In particular, honest has to do with the chastity of women. So the word virtue in the 17th century very often meant the fidelity of women to their husbands. This is interesting. Honest, meaning respectable, decent, or neat appearance. And this, or an appearance that is free from fraud. So if you think about that, that is exactly what Iago does. He presents a respectable, decent, and neat appearance that is free from fraud. And this is exactly why they call him Honest Iago. So they're not just saying truthful Iago, they're saying you present us a good image of decency and wholesomeness. The word honest has its root Latin honestus, that which is honorable. Honor. The person who is honorable is the person who is truthful. The person who is honorable is respectable, decent, and neat in appearance. Therefore, they're worthy of respect, right? Or deserving of honor, and so on and so forth. So you can see the various aspects of the meaning of the word honest historically actually all dovetail together to enrich our understanding of this seemingly offhand statement that everyone makes, honest Iago. And that it is ironic, that it is the opposite of the truth. So very briefly, I just want to run through the allegory of the cave in its most basic features. You have prisoners who see shadows on the wall, and they take the shadows for something other than what they really are. They take the shadows, which are appearances, as the reality themselves. And we notice, for example, that the shadows are actually 3 times removed from the original objects. So they see a shadow of a horse and take it for the reality of a horse, when in fact the shadow is being cast by an artifact, a sculpture of a horse. And the sculpture of the horse is not an actual horse. It is just a sculpture of a horse. It's a representation. So, and then of course the sculpture is based on the real thing. So we see that the shadow is the representation of a representation. So it's 3 times removed from reality. Who were these people casting these images? Well, likely they're the people who make the images and then project them on the wall. And that these were people who are in control. And how are they in control? They're in control of the people's minds. They rule not through physical shackles, but through a form of mind control. And they are making these images and presenting them in a way as puppet masters to control the minds. These objects are like the strings that help control the minds of the subjects or those who are imprisoned or enslaved, right? And they are doing it for their own self-interest, for their own benefit. Plato is certainly not Machiavelli, but it's acknowledged in the myth that they are doing this to advance their understanding. How else could it be acceptable to them that they know more of the truths about things and they leave people in this state of ignorance of taking the shadows for reality, which is exactly what they want. Okay, let's just mention, oh, so who are the people casting the images? That's Iago. Iago is the fashioner of the objects and the projector of these objects on the cave wall, which is really the mind, particularly of Othello, although it's the other characters too, right? And apart from his verbal lies, of course, the great lie that he presents is that the handkerchief represents the visual or ocular proof of Desdemona's infidelity. And of course, yes, it is the handkerchief. Yes, Cassio has it, but it does not represent her infidelity. In fact, that is a completely contrived thing, and therefore Othello cannot recognize the handkerchief for the shadow that it really is, that it does not actually represent what he's told to represent. And of course, the problem with the shadows is not that these people are dumb, it's their interpretation of the shadows. They don't know anything better other than to assume they are the reality. So it's that they take them from the wrong cognitive frame of reference and misinterpret them, right? And that is exactly what Othello does when he misinterprets the handkerchief, because he takes it from the wrong cognitive frame of reference, and that frame of reference is the one that's been devised by Iago since the beginning of the play. Othello is obviously the man in the shackles. And then the question of why is he in the shackles, right? He doesn't turn his head to see alternative facts or a different point of view. One of the discussions in the allegory of the cave is that these prisoners have their heads fixed so all they can see is that which is in front of them, as if they're kind of viewing a movie screen, right? And they can't see the origins of the movie that they're watching. They can't see behind the Wizard of Oz's curtain, right? And Othello is not able to see behind the Wizard of Oz, who's Iago's here. Casts a kind of magical spell, in a sense, on Othello. And I think there's a couple reasons. It's something about the emotional makeup of Othello that his emotions blind him to being suspicious, blind him to doubt in Iago. Also, Iago is tremendously convincing. You have to understand, it's hard to imagine, if you're one of those characters, the scope of the deception involved here, because it's not deceiving one person, it's deceiving a whole network of people, and they all act on that deception simultaneously. And so they're seeing the effective truth of the thing played out. Othello's seeing the effective truth of the plot played out in other characters. So it's actually more confirmation and more evidence of the truth of it when he sees, for example, Cassio petitioning his wife to get his job back. The thing that I always find fascinating is Othello's lack of approaching his wife and addressing her more directly, and instead putting all of her trust in Iago. And I think there are a number of different answers to this, starting with the effectiveness of Iago, going to the fact that if Desdemona really is unfaithful, then the only person he has to trust in his mind is Iago. Is Desdemona just like every other Venetian woman, who says one thing during the day and does another thing during the night, as we saw with Emilia? He doesn't trust his own instincts about his wife. And that's fascinating. And this also, Iago has never met a man who truly loved himself. Which is to say, everybody's insecure and seeks confirmation of their worth in others in ways that make them dependent on others. And Othello is made dependent on Iago, and therefore he can't overcome that dependency to see more clearly. Okay. So there's this basic language of appearance versus reality that we're going to see on display in the passage that we look at in just a moment and wrap things up. Between seeming and being, that which is visible and invisible. So think about it for a second. the handkerchief is visible, but the truth about it, what it means, is actually something invisible, right? It's a relation between things that one needs to know with the mind's eye rather than the eyes, right? And one knows with the eyes what one sees, and one knows with the mind's eye what one infers from what sees. And what Iago compels Othello to do is make an incorrect inference about the nature and meaning of that handkerchief. So visible and invisible. Opinion versus truth. You think something is the case, and opinions are based on emotions. They're based on our natural dispositions. They're based on the facts around us. But the difference between opinion and knowledge, or opinion and truth, is that you think it's the case because of various factors, but you haven't proven it to yourself with evidence that it actually is the case. So you can believe something that's actually true and it still just be a belief because you don't actually have the proof to demonstrate that what you think is true is actually knowledge. So therefore you've got the distinction between thinking and believing versus knowing, distinction between convention and nature, the way things are done versus the way things actually are. And therefore you have a distinction between the handkerchief as an appearance, which is to say a symbol of Desdemona's infidelity, versus the reality, which is the handkerchief was simply stolen by Iago's wife and planted with Cassio. Okay, so we're going to go in reverse order in looking at Iago's cave. In terms of the development of pouring the pestilence in in Othello's ear to convince him of his wife's infidelities. In this scene, Iago has just finished describing or insinuating the illicit relationship between Cassio and Desdemona to the point where Othello falls into this kind of epileptic fit or seizure. And then Cassio comes in while he's essentially incapacitated. So therefore Othello doesn't understand what's going on. And this not understanding what's going on is really symbolic of his emotions being wrought. Remember he says, my mind was wrought in the extreme by Iago. I was perplexed. Well, the perplexity manifests itself as these seizures. And so Cassio and Iago speak. The key thing is, Iago is going to start to speak to Cassio about Bianca, the courtesan that he's having a love affair with. Right? Othello is going to awake, and then Iago is going to instruct Othello, stay over here. I want you to watch my conversation with Cassio, and he's not going to know you're here, and I'm going to ask him about Desdemona. And what's going to happen is that, in fact, Cassio is going to talk about Bianca, and Othello is going to be under the assumption that he's talking about his own wife. And he's going to become, of course, enraged, and this will be the thing that decisively pushes him over the edge and compels him, from his point of view, forces his hand to take revenge on his wife and Cassio. Right? And this is a moment where Iago really crafts this cave, or even a kind of cage, a psychological cage for Othello. And so Cassio enters. What's the matter? He says, my lord is in an epilepsy. This is his second fit. He had one yesterday. Rub him about the temples. No. Forbear, the lethargy must have its quiet course. If not, he foams at the mouth and by breaks out in savage madness. Look, he stirs. Do you withdraw yourself a little while. He will recover. When he is gone, I would on great occasions speak with you. Exit Cassio. How is it, General? So notice he flips his character the moment he's interacting with someone else, and honest Iago adapts his appearance as he sees fit to each character he comes in contact with. "How is it, General? Have you hurt your head?" He acts like he doesn't understand what's going on, and in the previous passage he's made clear he understands exactly what's going on with Othello, and that's partly because he is actually responsible for putting Othello in this very state that he's in. It says, "Dost thou mock me?" So Othello understands. He has some vague understanding, and Iago acts like he doesn't know what he's talking about. "I mock you? No, by heaven. Would you bear your fortune like a man? A horned man, a monster, and a beast." All right, so this is a reference to some extent, the devil, but a horned man being a green-eyed monster who is jealous. Jealousy is the green-eyed monster. "Iago, there's many a beast than in the populous city, and many a civil monster." So this goes back to the kind of passionate nature of human beings and their self-interestedness, that they're driven by their passions like a beast or a monster would be. And then he says there's a many civil monster, which can be taken both ways. It can be civil monster could just be a reiteration of the monster of the populous city, or the word civil could be understood not as a monster of civil society, but could be a well-mannered and properly behaving monster. And I think that is exactly what Iago is, because he is monstrous. He characterizes his plot that way, and yet he is the epitome of civility and decorum. He's able to carry himself whenever he needs to with a kind of just icy decorum. Othello says, "Did he confess it?" He says, "Good sir, be a man." So notice he's acting like he hasn't just frothed him up in this state, and he's telling Othello, get your wits about you. Get your wits about you. "Think every bitted fellow that he's but yoked may draw with you. There's a million now alive that nightly lie in those unproper beds, which they dare swear peculiar. Your case is better. Oh, 'tis the spite of hell, the fiend's arch mock, to lip a wanton in a secure coach, and to suppose her chaste. No, let me know, and knowing what I am, I know what she shall be. Oh, thou art wise, 'tis certain, Iago. Stand you apart, confine yourself but in a patient list, whilst you were here overwhelmed with your grief, a passion most unsuiting such a man. Cassio came hither. I shifted him away, and laid good excuse upon your ecstasy, bade him anon return and here speak with me, the which he promised. Do but encave yourself, and mark the fleers, the gibes, and notable scorns that dwell in every region of his face. For I will make him tell the tale anew, where, how oft, how long, and when he hath and is again to cope your wife. I say, but mark his gesture, merry patience, or I shall say you're an all in spleen and nothing of a man. So he's saying, buck up, old pal, get over it, accept and listen to the truth, stop pretending like your wife is faithful to you, and take it like a man. And of course, this is all a lie, and so he has framed the whole circumstance in the way in which he wants Othello to interpret the scene that is going to unfold. And then Cassio and Iago speak again, in which he talks about Bianca, and in fact he talks about Bianca when Othello believes he's talking about Desdemona. And of course he speaks in a very cavalier and frivolous way, because he doesn't take this relationship very seriously, and that only makes Othello more angry. So here we're going on page 218, Act 3, Scene 3. We're going to look at really the central exchange between Iago and Othello, where Iago insinuates Desdemona's infidelity. And we will see just how cunning and sneaky he is. Rather than come out and spell it out in bold terms, he merely makes suggestions and allows Othello to infer from what's being said, such that it is Othello that is taking ownership of the thoughts of Desdemona's own infidelity. And so Othello has just had a happy and warm interaction with Desdemona, and he says, "Excellent wretch, perdition catch my soul, but I do love thee, and when I love thee not, chaos is come again." Perdition is a state of eternal damnation. So there's some ironic foreshadowing going on here. And he's speaking of his wife, and he says, I do love thee, eternal damnation, to heck with it. I love you, but if I don't, chaos is come again. His entire kind of integrated personality seems to hinge on the foundation of this relationship. So you pull that foundation away and you get chaos. And the chaos is obviously the chaos that ensues with all the characters, but particularly it's the chaos or disorder of Othello's soul. And so immediately after this is obviously a remark that foreshadows what is to come, but of course he doesn't know that. However, Iago is now going to insinuate himself with Othello and start to drop these suggestions in this incredibly artful way. He says, "My good lord, what dost thou say, Iago? Did Cassio, when you wooed my lady, know of your love?" So here is he going to, his one strategy is to ask questions and to have Othello answer them in his own mind. And here we have it acknowledged that Cassio's role was as a kind of go-between in the early stages of this relationship. "He did from first to last. Why dost thou ask?" The seeds of doubt being sowed in his head. "But for a satisfaction of my thought, no further harm." Right? So, satisfaction of my thought. I just wanted to know. Right? And this is one of those classic examples of someone brings something up and you say, well, why do you bring that up? Oh, nothing. Nothing. Right? And, of course, your first reaction is to go, oh, well, there must be a reason. "Why of thy thought, Iago?" So now we get this motif that Othello is aware of a thought in Iago's mind that Iago will not divulge. And Othello, because that's the bait, and the trap, Iago is determined to extract that thought. And what is the thought? It is the thought of Desdemona's infidelity, which of course is not really, in a sense it's not a thought because it's not true, it's not a true thought. And Iago doesn't really believe it, but creates the impression. "I did not think he had been acquainted with her." "Oh, yes, and went between us very oft." "Indeed." Pregnant, indeed. "Indeed, aye, indeed. Discern thou aught in that? Is he not honest?" Iago. "Honest, my lord." Othello. "Honest, aye, honest." Iago. "My lord, for aught I know." Right? So instead of just answering the question, of course he's honest, he says, why would I know? Right? "What dost thou think?" Right? So, in a sense, Iago doesn't think anything. He is just saying to Othello what he needs to say to get Othello to think what he wants him to think. "Think, my lord, by heaven, thou echoest me, as if there be some monster in thy thought." And of course there is. "Too hideous to be shown." So what's the problem here? Othello is the general, and Iago is his lieutenant, his right-hand man. And when you have a person of power, there's the problem of telling them the truth, because you want to stay in their good graces and get the power that you get from your position next to them. So what do? You flatter them, and you are apprehensive about telling them the truth, because the messenger is the person who get killed. So Iago is playing this game of being furtive and evasive in fact that's exactly what he wants to do in order to provoke Othello to demand what he's thinking. And then once he's got Othello worked up enough, he's going to deliver the claim of infidelity. Thou dost mean something. I hear thy say even now, thou likest not that when Cassio left my wife, what didst not like? And when I told thee he was of my counsel, in my course of wooing, thou criedest, indeed, and didst contract and purse thy brow together. So he's making facial expressions of disagreement with Cassio and concern, and it's all fake, it's all a show. As if thou hadst shut up in thy brain some horrible conceit, a concept, an idea, a thought. If thou dost love me, show me thy thought. So now he's tricked him, said, you must, if you really love me as a human being, you must tell me what's in your mind. And of course there's nothing there, because there's no truth to what he's trying to make him believe. Iago, my lord, you know I love you. I think thou dost. So the distinction here between thinking and knowing. You think it is the case because you have a few bits of evidence, but you know it's the case because you know conclusively that that is true. I think thou dost, and for I know thou art full of love and honesty, and weighest thy words before thou givest thy breath. So he's saying, you're just being discreet. I know you love me. I know you're honest. And I know you're just being discreet about potentially a sensitive subject. He says, therefore these stops of thine frighten me the more. So he says, I know you're honest, and the fact that you're not being open with me is disturbing, because this is not what I'm used to expecting. Of course, this is all contrived by Iago, and the stops are the pauses in his speech. And what happens when he pauses? It's like an acknowledgement that he's thinking something, right? For such things in a false disloyal knave are tricks of custom, which is exactly what he's doing, tricks. But in a man that's just and honest, they're closed dilations working from the heart, delations, working from the heart that passion cannot rule. So delations are delays. He's he's delaying what he's saying, and they're also, a delation is a report or accusation. So they are accusations coming from the heart that passion can't control. You have a passion to say the right thing to me, but you know what the right thing to do is, to be honest. For Iago, for Michael Cassio, I dare be sworn, I think that he is honest. I think it so too, Othello says. Men should be what they seem, or those that be not what they might seem, none. So men should be what they seem, and men that are what they are not, seem to be what they are not, should be none, should be dead. And of course, that plays into Othello's attitude, which is that men of honor present themselves in a forthright manner, and not deceptively. Othello, certain men should be what they seem. Well then, I think Cassio's an honest man. Right? So notice he's only saying that because Othello has demanded that men should be what they seem, and therefore he can see, okay, Cassio's a good guy. If you say so, therefore that's it. Othello, nay, there's more in this. I prithee speak to me as to thy thinkings, as thou dost ruminate, think, reflect, deliberate, and give thy worst of thoughts, the worst of words. So, this is classic here. He's got the ugly truth. concealed in his head, and he doesn't want to say it because he doesn't want to hurt Othello's feelings. But now he's really seduced Othello into saying these things. He says, "Good my lord, pardon." So, pardon me for saying these things. "Though I am bound to every act of duty, I am not bound to that all slaves are free to utter my thoughts. Why say they are vile and false, as wears that palace whereinto foul things sometimes intrude not. Who has a breast so pure, but so uncleanly apprehensions, keep leets and law days, and in session sit without meditations lawful?" Othello: "Thou dost conspire against thy friend, Iago, if thou but thinkest him wronged, and makest his ear a stranger to thy thoughts." Iago has suggested that he's actually, as an inferior officer, he is not in the position to speak of a truth that's so damaging. And he makes reference to a law court and their meditation such lawful. Does he have the authority to speak truth to power? And Othello says, again, tell me, speak to my ear. You wrong me if you don't tell me. And Iago says, "Though I perchance am vicious in my guess." So he's saying, I am a pessimistic, cynical person, and when I look into things, I always see the worst, right? Is this true? Not really. There's the worst within him, because that's what he is, but he knows these people are innocent. So he is saying, I'm the kind of guy who, when I look into things, I always assume and see the worst. And therefore that's going to only infuriate Othello more. He says, "Though I perchance am vicious in my guess, as I confess it is my nature's plague," it's the flaw in my nature, "to spy into abuses, and oft my jealousy shapes forms that are faults that are not." I see faults that are not really there. "That your wisdom, from one that so imperfectly conceits, would take no notice, nor build yourself a trouble out of his scattering and unsure observance. It were not for your quiet nod, your good, nor your good, nor for my manhood, honesty, and wisdom, to let you know my thoughts." So he's trying to give a series of justifications of why it's inappropriate and wrong, or even unlawful, to reveal himself. And he's being dilatory here. He's just kind of beating around the bush, and this is only infuriating Othello, because now because he's held out so long, he thinks it's something very serious. Othello goes, "Zounds, what does thou mean?" He's speaking in circles, right? "Good name in man and woman, dear lord, is the immediate jewel of their souls. Who steals my purse steals trash. 'Tis something, 'tis nothing, 'twas mine, 'tis his, and has been slave to 1,000s. But he that filches from me my good name robs me of that which not enriches him, and makes me poor indeed." So notice, again, he doesn't answer the question directly, and he sets it all up. Talks about having one's good name stolen from one's reputation. Right? And the insinuation here is that Cassio is stealing Othello's good name by cheating on his wife. But he does this all indirectly and forces Othello to make that inference from what's being said, because, here he speaks in a kind of abstract principle. He doesn't give any details. And so Othello is only more perplexed, and this is his mind being wrought and perplexed. This is the dialogue where that happens. He says, "By heaven, I'll know thy thoughts." Now let's be clear. Othello is the general. Othello is the commander. He is, at this point, prior he was asking for his thoughts. Now he is demanding it as his superior officer. Iago, "You cannot, if my heart were in your hand, nor shall not whilst 'tis in my custody. It says, you have no right. You have no right to my thoughts. Now here's the catch. Does Iago really want to withhold the thought about Cassio's infidelity with his wife? Of course not. He wants to broadcast it, but he has to build up the utmost credibility of this possibly being true by withholding it, and Othello believes that precisely since Iago is withholding it, he has good reason to withhold it, because he doesn't want to hurt Othello's feelings, right? So this is actually, you might call it a kind of reverse psychology. And Othello goes, ha! And then Iago still hasn't been clear, and then he says, oh, beware, my lord, of jealousy. It is the green-eyed monster with doth mocks the meat it feeds on. That cuckold lives in bliss, who certain of his fate loves not his wronger. But oh, what damned minutes tell her over, who dotes, yet doubts, suspects, yet strongly loves. So he says, beware of jealousy. He hasn't even claimed anything's happened, but he's building there's the central claim of the infidelity, and there's all the consequences around it. And he's building up all the consequences without touching on the central theme. And of course, jealousy will eat you alive. It mocks the meat it feeds on. And the cuckold who lives in bliss, who doesn't worry about, his wife's infidelity and doesn't take her too seriously. But the man is damned, the one who doubts his wife and yet still loves her strongly. And that's exactly Othello. Othello goes, oh, misery. Because think about it. At the moment Othello says, oh, misery, he is putting pieces together of the puzzle that Othello has given. And one way to think about this is Iago gives Othello all the pieces to the puzzle except one, the real fact about the infidelity. And he lets Othello infer that from the rest of the pieces. But he does his best not to actually state that until later on. Poor and rich is content, and rich enough, but riches fineless is as poor as winter. To him that ever fears he shall be poor. Good God, the souls of all my tribe depend from jealousy. Othello. Why? Why is this? Thou'st think I make a life of jealousy, to follow still the changes of the moon with fresh suspicion? So this is interesting. Othello acknowledges here that he's not a man inclined toward jealousy, and he connects it with the changes of the moon, like the fluctuations of one's character. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle talks about the virtuous person, the virtuous man, the one of virtuous character. Their character is steadfast and consistent and doesn't fluctuate in a capricious way, which is like one moment you're acting on this motion, the next moment you're acting on that. Othello is saying, I am a steadfast person. I am not given to these kind of recriminations or these kind of fears. I don't give in to emotional fluctuations of mood like the changes of the moon. He says, no, to be once in doubt is once to be resolved. So once you doubt, it's not stated explicitly, but once you doubt the fidelity of your significant other, you are resolved to believe in their infidelity. And doubt versus resolution, that's the difference between, thinking and knowing. Exchange for me a goat, when I shall turn the business of my soul to such exsulficate and blow surmises, matching thy inference. 'Tis not to make me jealous, to say my wife is fair, feeds well, loves company, is free of speech, sings, dances, and plays and dances where virtue is, these are more virtuous. Nor from mine own weak merits will I draw the smallest fear or doubt of her revolt. For she has eyes and chose me. No, Iago, I'll see before I doubt, and when I doubt, prove, and on the proof there is no more but this, away at once with love or jealousy. So he actually rebuffs Iago here, and he says, "I'm sorry. You haven't told me anything. You haven't given me any evidence, and therefore I believe in my wife's virtue," which is another word in this situation for fidelity. And the burden is now pushed away from Cassio and Desdemona to Iago. So Iago has to deliver up the goods now, and he's forced his hand. Iago says this: "I am glad of this, for now I shall have reason to show the love and duty that I bear you with franker spirit." So now he says, now I have an obligation to be more honest to you, because you don't get it. As I am bound by duty, receive it from me. I speak not yet of proof. And the handkerchief will be the ocular proof. It says, look to your wife, observe her well with Cassio. Now remember, that is the relationship that Iago is contriving. Wear your eyes thus, not jealous nor secure. Wear your eyes thus. This is how I want you to look at the situation. This is how I want you to interpret the shadows that you see. I would not have your free and noble nature, out of self-bounty, be abused. Look to it. I know our country disposition. I know our country disposition well. In Venice, they do not let God see the pranks they dare not show their husbands. Their best conscience is not to leave undone, but to keep unknown. It is not to leave it undone, but to keep it unknown. So the disposition, the country's disposition, is the Venetian disposition to act one way in the light and to be another way in the dark, right? And that's what this dovetails with Amelia's speech later on. And they dare not show their husbands their best conscience is not to leave it undone, but kept unknown. So keeping a good conscience in this society is not being a good person, but it's transgressing and making sure you don't get caught. And in Venice, they do let God see their pranks, because of course God sees everything. God sees it, but not their husbands, right? And they've got their priorities, right? So they don't leave it undone, they leave it unknown, which is to say, they perform the act of fidelity. They just make sure that their husbands don't know about it. And of course, this is the kind of stereotype of the Venetian woman, and Venetian men as well. And of course, Desdemona does not fit this stereotype. She really is a different type of woman, even as she's young. And Othello, in a sense, knows all this, but he just doesn't believe Desdemona is this kind of woman, and Iago's going to try to convince him. Dost thou say so? She did deceive her father, marrying you, and when she seems to shake and fear your looks, she loved them most. Othello, and so she did. Iago, she that so young could give out such a seeming to seal her father's eyes up, close as oak, he thought 'twas witchcraft, but I am much to blame. I humbly do beseech you of your pardon for too much loving you. Othello, I am bound to thee forever. Iago, I see this hast little dashed your spirits. Not a jot, not a jot. Iago, I fear it has. I hope you will consider what is spoke, come from my love, but I do see you moved. All right, so there's now competing between Desdemona's love and Iago's love. I am to pray you not to strain my speech to grosser issues, nor to larger reach than to suspicion. So I'm not giving you proof, I'm just giving you enough to suspect. I will not, Iago. Should you do so, my lord, my speech should fall into such vile success, as my thoughts aim not at Cassio's, my worthy friend. My lord, I see you're moved. No, not much moved. I do not think but Desdemona's honest. So there's that word. So not just truthful, but worthy of honor, honorable. Live long she so, and long live you to think so, right? So, isn't he's saying, isn't that cute that you think she's so honest? And yet, how nature erring from itself. Nature erring from itself. Well, nature is imperfect, but I think this is a play on Desdemona's nature. He knows Desdemona's nature to be virtuous. So how could it err from being virtuous when that's not her nature? So her nature would err from itself if she committed this transgression. Iago. Aye, there's the point, as to be bold with you, not to affect my proposed matches of her own clime, complexion, and degree, whereto we see in all things nature tends. Where does nature tend? Toward the passions, toward self-interest? Foe, one may smell in such a will most rank, foul disproportion, thoughts unnatural. But pardon me, I do not in position distinctly speak of her, though I may fear her will, recoiling to her better judgment, may fall to match you with her country's forms, and happily repent. So, in so many words, he insinuates that the customs of Venice will get the better of her nature. And Othello says, farewell, farewell, farewell. So what's happened here? Iago has laid the groundwork for suspicion, and Othello has largely rebuffed him. But this is really just laying the foundation of doubt, and not the kind of coup de grace that we're going to see in a moment. And lastly here, we're going to look at the beginning of Act 4 that ties in together two themes. One, the language of appearance and reality, and the introduction of the handkerchief as the ocular proof. Because once Iago has set these doubts in motion, at first he makes Othello vulnerable, but then he comes to be reassured about his wife, and he says, Iago, you are the one making the accusation against my wife. You are the one who is causing disrepute, not my wife. And if you are going to say this, you better prove to me that this is true. Otherwise, it's going to be your head and not my wife. And of course, this tension between the two, fomented by his feelings that, one or the other is being faithful to him, and he chooses the wrong one, only intensifies the problem. So we'll see here the distinction between seeming and being, and thinking and knowing. 1 Scene 4, Iago. Will you think so? Othello. Think so, Iago? Iago. What? What, to kiss in private? Othello. An unauthorized kiss. Iago. Or to be naked with a friend in bed an hour or more, not meaning any harm? So, he's insinuating things. He's not explicitly saying Desdemona is doing these things. He's just kind of speaking in hypotheticals, and Othello is compelled to take these hypotheticals as indicative of actual behavior. Naked in bed, Iago, and not mean harm? Is it hypocrisy against the devil? They that mean virtuously, and yet do so, the devil, their virtue tempts, and they tempt heaven. Iago. So they do nothing. 'Tis a venial slip, but if I give my wife a handkerchief. What then? Othello says. Iago. Why then, 'tis hers, my lord, and being hers, she may, I think, bestow it on any man. So he's speaking in hypotheticals here, but he knows exactly what he's making reference to. Othello. She is protectress of her honor too. May she give that? Her honor is her fidelity, her chastity. Her honor is an essence that's not seen. right? This is the problem here. Honor, it partly deals with her reputation. That's an invisible thing. And nobody sees what people do behind closed doors, whether they maintain their honor or virtue or not. So therefore that's invisible. And of course it can be taken away invisibly. Her honor is an essence that's not seen. They have it very oft, or they have it not. But for the handkerchief, right? So the handkerchief is actually being associated and a symbol for her honor and virtue. Othello, by heaven, I would most gladly had forgot it. Thou saidst, oh, it comes of my memory, as doth the raven over the infectious house, boding to all he had my handkerchief. Ah, what of that? Othello, that's not so good now. Iago, what if I had said... So this is all hypothetical, and Othello is just kind of blowing this off. And now Iago says, and this is all a kind of insinuation. What if I had said I had seen him do you wrong? Now think about the hypothetical nature of that statement. What if I had said that I had seen him do you wrong? Well, you've just said it. Saying it doesn't make it true. Or heard him say, as knaves be such abroad, who, having by their own importune suit or voluntary dotage of some mistress, conceived or supplied them, could not choose, but they must blab. Othello, hath he said anything? So this is an if-then. This is a conditional statement. Is the condition true? Iago, he hath, my lord. But be you well assured, no more than he'll unswear. What hath he said? Iago, faith that he did. I know not what he did. I know not what he did. Iago, lie? Now think about the word lie here. Notice that the word lie is taken out of context. Yes, it's the continuation of what he did, but he doesn't say what he did, what Michael Cassio did was to lie with her, your wife. Every section of the sentence is taken in isolation, and it's Othello who pieces it all together in his own imagination and completes the sentence that what Iago is trying to say is that he is aware through rumor of Michael Cassio having laid with his wife, Othello's wife, and therefore slept with her. Iago says, Othello, what, lie? Othello, with her? Question mark. Iago, with her, on her, what you will. Now notice this. With her, on her, these are a bunch of prepositions that only make sense if taken in conjunction with everything that's been previously stated. The point here is that Iago doesn't string the whole sentence together himself. So he doesn't actually have to lie. What he does is just put out these phrases and allows Othello to synthesize them in his own imagination. With her, on her, what you will. So whatever it is. And of course, what you will is what you're willing to believe. And Othello now starts to put them together. Lie with her, lie on her. We say lie on her when they belie her. Lie with her, zounds, that's fulsome. Handkerchief, confessions, handkerchief. To confess and be hanged for his labor. First to be hanged and then to confess. So now Othello has been seduced into moving from doubt to conviction, and yet Iago has not really told a lie, but the thing that he did was to introduce the handkerchief. That what if I told you I saw Michael Cassio with the handkerchief? And it is the handkerchief that becomes the bit of proof that pushes Othello from doubting Iago to now doubting his wife to now a full-blown belief that she has slept with Cassio. And then obviously in the next scene is when Othello has this epileptic fit, and then Cassio and Iago speak to one another, and Cassio is actually talking about Bianca. Yet that shadow of the conversation to Othello appears as a discussion about Desdemona. Handkerchief, confessions, handkerchief, to confess and be hanged for his labor. First to be hanged and then to confess. I tremble at it. Nature would not invest herself in such shadowing passions without some instruction. It is not words that shake me thus. It is not words, it is evidence. Pish! Noses, ears, and lips. He wants to cut them off, right? And, this is not a totally foreign practice to do these kind of things when people have transgressed, like you cut someone's hand off when they've committed a robbery. And, of course, these are all, parts of the body that are part of intimacy and connectedness. And this is his speculating on revenge. He says, is it possible? So he's still in a state of confusion, but he's being pushed. And then the next scene, he's going to see the handkerchief, and that will be the definitive moment where there is no turning back, there is no more doubt. Confess, handkerchief, O devil. And now the O devil is, of course, Desdemona, when, of course, we all know all along that the real devil is Iago.